Europe is staring into the abyss, and no, this isn't some distant forecast or a polite warning. It's a crisis happening right now. It's the nightmare scenario energy analysts have whispered about for years, always hoping it would stay theoretical. But today, across the continent, the gauges on the massive underground caverns that store Europe's energy lifeblood are dropping to terrifying levels. A perfect storm of war, sanctions, and a brutal winter is pushing the continent's gas reserves toward effectively empty, threatening to unleash an economic and social catastrophe we haven't seen in our lifetime. We're talking about a level of strain on the pipelines and terminals that power European industry and heat its homes that rivals, and in some ways is even worse than, the crisis of 2022. But this time things are different, more complex, and potentially far more devastating. The pillars of Europe's energy security, built so carefully after the last shock, are crumbling. We're about to show you the hard data and the market signals that all point to one unavoidable conclusion. Europe is on the brink. Industries are facing shutdown. Millions of homes are at risk of going dark and cold. This is the story of how Europe's worst nightmare came true. It didn't start with a bang. It started as a slow, creeping dread that has now exploded into outright panic. As of early March 2026, gas storage levels across the European Union have fallen to a perilous 29%. Now, to you and me, that number doesn't sound like zero. But in the world of energy logistics, it's a five-alarm fire. You see, these reserves aren't like the gas tank in your car that you can run down to the last drop. The pressure in these vast underground reservoirs has to be maintained. As the gas level falls, it gets physically harder to pull it out fast enough to meet demand. Below a certain point, the gas is still there, but you can't get to it. We are getting dangerously close to that point. And in Europe's industrial heartland, it's even worse. Germany, the continent's economic engine, has seen its storage levels crash to just over 21%. A figure not seen at this time of year in over a decade. The Netherlands, a critical hub for gas trading, is in an even worse spot, with its reserves at a shocking 9%. These aren't just numbers on a trader's screen. They represent a clear and present danger to the entire European project. And to understand how we got here, you have to look at the event that lit the fuse on this time bomb. What we're seeing isn't a single failure. It's a cascade of crises all hitting at once, a perfect storm in the truest sense. Any one of these problems would have been a major challenge. Together, they've created a vortex of price spikes and supply shortages that is dragging the continent into an energy catastrophe. The first front blew open in the Middle East. The escalating conflict involving Iran, Israel, and the United States, which ignited in late February 2026, sent an immediate shockwave through global energy markets. In response to attacks, Iran's Revolutionary Guard did what was once unthinkable. It effectively sealed off the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow channel is the world's most important energy choke point. About 20% of the world's daily oil supply flows through it. And critically for this crisis, so does 20% of the entire global trade in liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Just like that, all LNG exports from two powerhouse producers, Qatar and the UAE, stopped cold. Iran's actions led to the complete shutdown of Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, the largest LNG complex on the planet, responsible for about a fifth of the world's supply. The effect was instant and brutal. An estimated 1.5 million tons of LNG per week vanished from the global market. Ships loaded with gas were trapped inside the Persian Gulf, and a fleet of empty tankers piled up outside, unable to get in. For Europe, this was a body blow. The continent had spent years trying to get off Russian gas by replacing it with LNG from the sea. Qatar was supposed to be a key part of that plan. In the first half of 2025, Italy got 36% of its LNG from Qatar. Belgium got 24%. With one move, a primary alternative supplier was gone. The market reaction was sheer panic. The Dutch TTF, Europe's benchmark gas price, went vertical. After trading around $31 per megawatt hour, prices shot up by nearly 50% in the first week alone, hitting averages of $45 an hour. At its peak, the price flirted with $70, a level not seen since the worst days of the 2022 crisis. This wasn't just market jitters. It was a physical supply shortfall that traders knew couldn't be fixed overnight. Now, here's where it gets worse. While the first front opened in the Middle East, a second front, one of Europe's own making, began to bite. This is how a policy designed to punish Russia backfired at the worst possible moment. In late 2025 and early 2026, the EU adopted its 19th sanctions package against Russia, including a phased-in ban on all Russian gas and LNG imports by 2027. The goal was to permanently cut the energy ties Moscow had used as a weapon. But the devil was in the details. The rules included clauses that banned imports under short-term contracts starting as early as April 2026. This created a legal and logistical nightmare for European energy firms like France's Total Energies, which held contracts for gas from Russia's Yamal LNG project. Just as a massive hole from Qatar's supply appeared, Europe found itself legally tangled up, unable to even trade the controversial Russian volumes it still had access to. It was a case of political goals crashing head-on into market reality. Ironically, in the months leading up to the crisis, European companies had been quietly buying up Russian LNG. In February 2026, 100% of the LNG from the massive Yamal facility went straight to European buyers. This wasn't politics, it was business. Yet, when the Hormuz crisis hit, these very supply lines were snarled in sanctions, forcing Europe to fight an energy war with one hand tied behind its back. Russia, without having to do a thing, suddenly found itself in a fantastic position. As global prices soared, the value of its own sanctioned energy skyrocketed. The crisis gave Moscow exactly what it wanted: more money and a European continent in total disarray. The third and final front wasn't politics, it was the weather. The winter of 2025-2026 was unusually harsh across Europe. Weeks of freezing temperatures meant heating demand was way higher than expected. On top of that, periods of low wind meant that gas-fired power plants had to run harder to make up for the lack of renewable energy, draining reserves even faster. This is the context that people miss. Europe walked into this geopolitical firestorm already weak. At the end of February 2026, storage levels across the EU were about 10% below 2025 levels. The 5-year average for this time of year was around 45%. In March 2026, the EU was struggling to stay near 30%. The cold winter had burned through the safety cushion. It was gone. So when the twin shocks from Hormuz and the sanctions hit, there was nothing left to absorb the impact. The continent was completely exposed. This three-headed monster created the perfect storm, and the consequences are now being felt in every factory, office, and home in Europe. This is an incredibly complex situation, and understanding these details is more important than ever. The mainstream news often misses these connections between geopolitics and market reality. If you want to keep getting this kind of in-depth analysis that goes beyond the headlines, take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It really helps us keep making this content and ensures you stay ahead of the curve. Now let's get back to the consequences of this disaster. The immediate problem of low storage is now being magnified by a second crisis, a global chain reaction that's making a terrible situation even worse. Europe isn't an island. It's a huge customer in a global energy market. And with the Strait of Hormuz blocked, that market has been thrown into chaos. The continent is now in a frantic, high-stakes bidding war for every spare molecule of gas on the planet, and it's a war it might not win. The logic is simple and brutal. With Qatar's massive facility offline, a giant hole has been torn in the global LNG supply. Nations that depended on Qatar are now desperate. Look at South Asia. In 2025, Pakistan got nearly all of its LNG from Qatar. India relied on it for over half of its imports. These aren't wealthy European nations. They're developing economies where energy means survival. Now they're being forced to compete on the open market for the same limited supply of LNG. This is where the laws of supply and demand become a weapon. Asian buyers facing blackouts and industrial collapse are willing to pay almost anything. Almost immediately, Asian LNG prices started trading at a premium to Europe's. So what happened? LNG tankers already on the water, originally sailing for ports in the UK or the Netherlands, started making sharp U-turns in the middle of the ocean, diverting away from Europe and heading for the higher-paying markets in Asia. For Europe, this is a catastrophe. The continent's entire plan for surviving and refilling its storage was based on a flood of LNG imports, especially from the United States. But U.S. producers aren't loyal. They'll sell their cargo to whoever pays the most. The other LNG superpowers, the United States and Australia, are already running their facilities at or near full blast. There is no secret reserve of production that can be switched on to fill the gap left by Qatar. The market is asking, can other exporters ramp up? And the answer is a resounding no. Not at this scale and not this quickly. Europe is now in a direct head-to-head fight with energy-starved Asian nations for a finite number of shipments. Even if the conflict in the Middle East ended tomorrow, it would take weeks, if not months, for the market to rebalance. Energy analysts are already warning that if the Hormuz disruption lasts through the summer, Europe could enter next winter with dangerously low storage. This isn't just a problem for the spring of 2026. It's a crisis that could stretch into 2027. Europe faces the huge task of refilling its reserves during the summer, but it will have to do it while paying sky-high prices and fighting off fierce competition. The cost might be so high that Europe can't even hit its mandated 90% storage target before the next winter. This crisis is laying bare the weaknesses in Europe's key economies. Let's go back to Germany and the Netherlands. Their storage facilities, holding about 35% of the EU's total, aren't just low. They're in physically difficult territory. Many of the Dutch facilities are old, depleted gas fields. Unlike modern salt caverns, the pressure in these fields drops as they empty, meaning you can't pull the gas out as fast. At 10% or below, the gas is there, but you can't get to it. Think of it like having a full bank account, but only being able to withdraw a few dollars a day. The Netherlands is basically already below its operational limit. For Germany, the challenge is sheer size. With storage around 21 to 23%, the country has to inject a massive amount of gas just to get back to a safe level. Analysts have pointed out that German gas storage is at its lowest point for this time of year in a decade. The government in Berlin keeps insisting that supplies are secure, but behind the scenes they're being forced to consider drastic measures like creating a strategic national reserve, a move they've always resisted. The fact they're even talking about it shows how scared they really are. This whole situation is creating a vicious cycle. Low storage creates panic, driving up prices. Higher prices pull LNG cargoes away from Europe, making it harder to refill storage. And the failure to refill storage guarantees that prices will stay high, which brings us to the devastating real-world impact of this crisis. So what does this all mean for the real world? The abstract numbers on screens are now turning into concrete, painful realities. We are seeing the start of a widespread economic shock that could trigger a recession, cripple key industries, and push millions into energy poverty. The first and most immediate casualty is Europe's industrial base. For industries that use a ton of energy, chemicals, steel, glass, fertilizers, soaring gas prices aren't an inconvenience. They're a death sentence. In Germany, when the price of gas goes up, the price of electricity follows almost perfectly. This makes a chemical plant or a steel mill instantly uncompetitive on the world market. The continent is facing the very real threat of large-scale deindustrialization. We're not just talking about temporary shutdowns. We're talking about companies permanently closing factories in Europe and moving to places with cheaper energy, like the U.S. or the Middle East. Goldman Sachs has warned of widespread demand destruction, a clinical term for a brutal reality. Factories go dark, and workers lose their jobs. We saw a preview of this in 2022, but this time is different. Back then, Europe could switch from gas to coal to generate electricity, which acted as a safety valve. But since then, much of that coal power has been shut down as part of the green transition. Europe, in the words of one analyst, traded one vulnerability for another. By getting rid of the backup plan, it made itself even more of a hostage to the price of gas. The pain isn't being felt equally. Countries like Italy, which rely heavily on gas for power, are extremely exposed. But Spain, with more renewables, is more insulated. This is creating deep cracks in the EU, as some countries suffer far more than others. In the first week of March, power prices surged to their highest levels of the year in Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Belgium. For ordinary people, this is a brutal assault on the cost of living. The cost of power from gas plants across Europe has jumped by over 50% in just the first 10 days of the conflict. That will inevitably show up in household electricity and heating bills that were already painfully high. Governments are now under immense pressure to step in with subsidies again, but their finances are already strained from the last crisis. This leads to the final consequence: political panic. The European Commission has publicly stated there are no immediate risks to supply, a statement that seems completely disconnected from the panic in the markets. In Brussels, there is a frantic search for solutions, but every option is a bad one. They're talking about a price cap on gas again. But as many analysts point out, that could be a disaster. An artificial price cap would make Europe the least attractive place in the world for LNG sellers. At the exact moment the continent needs to fight for every cargo, a price cap would be like telling every LNG tanker on the planet to sail to Asia instead. It would cripple Europe's ability to rebuild its reserves for next winter. And all of this? It's a huge, unexpected gift to Russia. For Moscow, the situation is almost perfect. It profits from soaring energy prices. It gets to watch as Europe's unity frays under economic pressure. And it sees the continent that tried to sanction it into oblivion now so desperate for gas that the temptation to quietly start buying again becomes enormous. Europe is caught in a trap. It can't afford the high prices, but it can't afford to cap them either. It wants to get off fossil fuels, but in the short term, it's more dependent on them than ever. It tried to punish Russia, but it has ended up punishing itself. The continent is staring down the barrel of a long, cold, and expensive period of economic decline and social unrest, all because the safety net was gone when the perfect storm finally hit. So there you have it. A toxic brew of war in a critical energy choke point, self-sabotaging sanctions, and the fallout from a harsh winter has brought Europe's energy system to its knees. The gauges aren't just low. They're a reflection of a deep vulnerability that has been brutally exposed. Storage facilities in Germany and the Netherlands are at their lowest levels in years, teetering on the edge of failure. A global bidding war for LNG means there is no easy way out, as Europe is forced to fight with desperate nations in Asia for a shrinking supply of fuel. The nightmare scenario is no longer a what-if, it's here. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz cut off a vital energy artery, wiping 20% of global LNG trade off the market overnight. The EU's own sanctions against Russia ironically tightened the screws at the worst possible moment, while Moscow profits from the chaos. This isn't just an energy crisis. It's a geopolitical, economic, and social crisis all rolled into one. The decisions made in the coming weeks in Brussels and Berlin will determine if this is a temporary shock or the start of a permanent decline. Leaders are trapped between politically popular but economically suicidal ideas like price caps and the harsh reality of letting the market run wild. The immediate challenge is to survive the current crunch without causing a full-blown depression. The long-term challenge is to figure out how Europe can build an energy system that isn't perpetually hostage to the next geopolitical shock. As Europe stands on this cliff edge, one thing is certain: the era of cheap, abundant energy is over. A new, harsher reality has begun, and the continent is just starting to reckon with the staggering cost of its worst nightmare coming true. The story doesn't end here. The fallout from this crisis will be felt for years, and things are changing every day. To make sure you don't miss our future updates on this and other critical global issues, be sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Thanks for watching.